Hold it! Stay right there. What are you waiting for? Kill them! Kill them both! Now, wait a minute. Is it money you're after? I'll give you as much as you want.
May the saints forgive you, because I won't.
Hey, you're listening to another episode of Threshold Saints. This is Jin the Ninja, and enjoy the show.
Hey, so I'm joined today by amazing researcher, artist, writer, philosopher king maybe, Robby Marx, who I'm a big fan of. Hey, Robby.
Hey, how you doing, Jim?
I'm really well, thank you very much. Do you want to introduce yourself in case people aren't familiar with you and your work, and also plug everything that you have?
Sure. Pretty much in the winter time, I'm an artist, and in the summertime, I kind of go out and travel around the country, and in between, just kind of consistently try to take care of commission jobs that I work on for various bands, and then I research in the background, which has kind of become a byproduct of me getting on various podcasts and almost in a sense becoming a storyteller in a lot of ways, which I find to be really fun. But nonetheless, if you want to check out my work, you can go to my link tree, which is Linktree and then RMARX, all one word, R Marks, and that'll pull up all my links to my podcast, Instagram, Facebook, etc.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I just will say we did actually do a podcast last night.
Right.
Obviously, this won't be coming out on the same day, but by the time it comes out, I think Lee will have dropped it. So we'll just shout that out. And then obviously you've done an amazing 4-part now series on Solomon's Temple with Nick from Occult Rejects and obviously Teresa. So I'll shout that out because I'm a big fan of that series. Like, I've always liked your work. You're pretty much, I mean, you know this, but you're the reason why I started wanting to podcast, like wanting to kind of tell more long form narrative story arcs and do comparative mythology. I think that's what really is fascinating about you, because there's a lot of people that like dabble in Tower of Babel, Nimrod, Janus, but I love the way you presented it and love the way that you did a full arc, and you always leave possibilities for the narrative to change. You don't concretize kind of the abstraction into like this into dogmatism. You kind of let it be, like you kind of let it have room to evolve, which I really appreciate. I try and do that. I'm still learning, I'm still growing, but I try. So
yeah. And I think with that, it's just the nature of how I view reality itself in regard to it being amorphous and like fractaline and constantly changing and moving and shit. It's like the one thing you can count on is change. So, what you're seeing in the histories is really just a brief snapshot, and with a lot of this esoterica type stuff, it's not really readily available or told. So kind of as you're going through these various texts, you kind of get little just puzzle pieces along the way. And cumulatively over the past 35 years of, really just being in the texts, you kind of start to get this menagerie of like almost a spider web or like Indra's net, how every drop of dew on the web reflects upon itself, and basically they all interact and reflect while simultaneously shifting and moving and changing.
Yeah, well said. That was quite amazing, quite poetic. I love that you bring in the IE stuff, like the Indo-European stuff. I love that you do a lot of biblical history, but you don't do it from a place of religiosity. And I'm not criticizing people who come at it from a more, perhaps more Christian paradigm. But I just sometimes I think that it has its own pitfalls, just like everything. Just like if you adhere to a specific ideological kind of standpoint, your work will obviously reflect that standpoint, and that's not necessarily bad. But I think the way you do it, you make it a lot more comprehensive, maybe like a little bit Joseph Campbell, a little bit more, I don't want to say universal, but there is an element of perennialism, and I do use that word quite often myself, and it might not be the right word, but I think it reflects something that's happening or has happened.
And I think going through all this stuff, as far as the texts, as far as the various poets, as far as looking at the artwork of the artists through the ages, there is very much a perennialism that is encapsulated within the philosophy. I think it's just been part of what the story is for so long, that it's just a recognition of the fact that I think really it goes back to there being a one world kind of philosophical system based around, because you see pyramids on every continent. You see within every culture, from South America to Egypt to Mesopotamia, the same type of figures holding the same type of implements. And I think that just cosmically, it is very perennial. And I think that the temple system, like worldwide, that they were actually in accordance with the story of the turning of the heavens. I think that temples were built and broken down and moved and resituated. And we've talked, like Dave was, talking about the telemic currents of the earth, or the feng shui almost of the earth itself. And I think that, over time that morphs and moves and changes, just like we do internally as people.
I totally agree with this. I think this is a very interesting discussion that I've had with also Grub, and he often talks about the kind of pinning down of these like telluric currents, or chi channels, or they have so many ley lines, they have so many different names, but he often talks about how different civilizations will kind of build specific obelisk style monuments or rock mounds. It can differ, obviously.
Yep. Yep.
But they build them, and then it kind of pins the dragon current down, and then it can be utilized by that society. And then when that society kind of either is replaced or falls away, then we kind of have to redefine where those dragon currents are, because obviously the previous civilization has changed it. And from a Chinese medicine perspective, I think that is exactly like how it's described, like the Nadan channels, like it's the microcosm and the macrocosm, right? Like as above, so below. I didn't even like that saying, but I'm going to use it because it's so universal. People know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and it is interesting when you start getting into these universal ideas that you can kind of almost place over different philosophies, as far as to maybe bring them together, generalize, kind of start to see bigger patterns within the whole. And yeah, with the standing stones, it's interesting because looking around the world, strangely enough, I've found that the largest number of standing stones are all within like around Israel and Gaza and the Golan Heights, so as far as pinning down, telemic or dragon, or whatever you want to call these energies that are moving and flowing through the earth, I think that area, which is why the Solomon's Temple kind of story, as far as the temple at the center of time, kind of is very relevant in our modern, and has been for thousands of years.
I totally agree with you. And again, everybody go check out that series, and I will put those links specifically below, as well as your amazing appearance on End of Days. So I also was there, but I mean, it was really your show. But I just think that you're totally right about Solomon's Temple. I agree with you like 99% on like everything. And I tend to take a contrarian sort of opinion about things, sometimes as just a rhetorical device, and sometimes because I actually believe it. It's not that I never believe it. It's just that I
Yeah.
think sometimes it's interesting to play at an adversarial role.
Oh yeah.
And you get a lot of like interesting kind of like discursive content from being adversarial. So it's not necessarily me just being an ass. I just think that sometimes it's interesting to challenge, and it's okay. People do that to me too.
Oh yeah. And honestly, if you go through my work, I don't even know that I agree with all of what I say necessarily, but it is the cohesive part of the story.
Mhm.
And I am oftentimes very adversarial in my point of view when I'm presenting things, but I do go back and forth from direct history to and I've always found, and it drives my wife crazy. But whenever I enter into a conversation, like socially, when we're out and about or at a party or something, I always take the adversarial role. And my wife is like, "Do you realize how you sound sometimes?" And I'm like, "Yeah, but I'm just trying to draw the matter out to
Mhm.
get
Mhm.
to the heart of the subject, you know?" And it's that's the whole thing is when you get into philosophy and you start looking at every side, and you don't necessarily participate with the current or past dialectic, and you kind of know the sides in whole, it's easy to jump in and dance around those subjects. And sometimes in the modern world, the way people talk to each other is like they think that what you're giving them is your opinion, whereas that's not how philosophy works. The idea is to hash an item out, steel sharpens steel, basically bringing what the truth itself is from the fallacy.
I completely agree. You and I are on the same page. I think that discourse is very dialectical. I think that synthesis is where knowledge is produced and truth is also found. So
Right.
I think that without that kind of like adversarial or alchemical discourse, I think that you cannot really get to the heart of it, just exactly like what you said. And I think that's been a theme, and I think this will continue to be a theme of my show in particular, like my own feed. And I just think it's a very difficult thing because you are playing to a lot of contemporary politics at the same time. I don't know if this is a challenge for you, but I know that it can be hard to articulate things exactly like what you said that aren't necessarily your opinion, but you are kind of reflecting these discursive ideas in a greater way, in a public way. And you want to do it in a way that's not overly inflammatory, but you also
Right.
want to do it in an honest way, like a way
Right.
that you're cutting through the bullshit and you're not like letting it weigh you down in like what is considered normie discourse. And you also want to follow like where the trail leads you. Like you are looking at a very historical, a very metaphysical, and it's all tied in. It's it's historical materialism, and
Right.
it's metaphysical history.
Right.
So it's like this is a very complicated thread that you're kind of pulling at.
Mm. But it's the most fun thread to pull at, you know.
Yeah, no, of course it is. So, Robbie, give us like I know this is like it will be hard, but if you could surmise kind of a brief history of the capstone and its importance and what you think is going on,
Mm.
is there a way?
The stone that the builder refused shall always be the head cornerstone. Um, it's yeah, the capstone. When you go back into the metaphysical ideas of the pyramids, there's debates in regard to, in South America they talk about filling up these pools of water that are the plazas below the pyramids, so they could stand on top of the pyramids and look at the water, the reflection in the water, rather than cocking their heads up at the heavens. And then you get into the idea that the capstone is something that can never be, because like man, the universal idea of man in the heavens, the head itself, the Godhead per se, Kether, is an idea that's outside of time and space. So that cosmic idea of the universal man with the head missing is very much the idea of the pyramid, that the true capstone is metaphysical. It exists in another realm of being. So it's very philosophical. And then when you get into the dollar bill with the eye of providence, that eye of providence, the way I've always looked at it is when you look at the formation of geometry through time and space, as far as the one realizing itself and examining its exterior, creating the two, as far as the circumpunct, the universe with the idea of God form in the center, and then traveling between the one and the two gives you three. So and then that essentially gives us the first geometric form that is the triangle, or that capstone that we see on the pyramid on the dollar bill. And that eye that's looking through is actually the eternal force that is the force generator, that is both yin and yang, grinding, pressing, creating, moving, in a beautiful and a perverse manner, but that is the eye of that entity being able to look into crystallized reality for the first time. And as far as the capstone, when you start looking at Jesus, he is the stone that the builder refused, in essence, as far as within Judaism, right? Because as one of the many Mishiachs that Judaism has risen up and then discarded, Jesus was almost immediately refused from the beginning. So within the pyramid that is the Judaic philosophy, the etheric idea of the Christ man through all of time and history, as far as those pure light beings that ascend, to the earthly realm. And then you get into that whole 70 by 70, two sevens clashing, basically giving us the 490 year, like cycle of prophets, like ascending to the earthly realm as sort of bodhisattvas, kind of just to help the whole in different ways. But that's the thing, everybody wants to refuse this cornerstone. Everybody wants to refuse these paths that will take us into the higher being. And it's, just philosophically through time, it's a very interesting subject matter for sure.
I totally agree with you. I'm more on the, as I think you know this, I'm more on the metaphysical. I love the history. I think the history is very dense, and I am not a particular like Masonic researcher. It was never something I even was very aware of. Like growing up Catholic, it was very, very, very looked down upon to be, especially because my if you have grandparents who are pre-Vatican II Catholics, they would be very against secret societies. So, right? So, because it was like it's an offense against the church. That's how it was considered pre-V2. So, the idea of being in a secret society, regardless of what it was very taboo, transgressive. So I think for me, I never really recognized how important they are and how important they were. And I think maybe you're the right person to kind of like can you just give a brief summation of like who you think they were? Do you think that they were different factions? And do you think that categorizing them as good and evil is useful for other researchers? And why or why not? I know that's a pretty huge question,
Right.
but
So it's interesting, diametrically, when you look at Hebrew, Kabbalah, and the Tree of Life, And then you look at the Masonic use of Kabbalah and the Tree of Life as well. And you have to say, why is the Jewish faith, as far as the mystics within the Jewish faith, because you're not allowed to even look at or read Kabbalah until you're at least 45 years old, and no women are allowed within the Jewish faith as far as Kabbalah, right? But then when you get into the Masonic orders, it's like, why would these Western, basically the genitalia of the government, basically be using this same Sephirotic system? And so, and I've traced both sides back. As far as the Jewish, when you go back, it kind of really comes out of the Babylonian exile and the creation of the Talmudic Jew in the first century BC. But when you look at the Masons, so reading Mackey in the Masonic Encyclopedia, it really goes back to these worshipers in Phoenicia that were worshiping Tamuz, which is a form of Nimrod, basically. And from that area in Phoenicia, when King Hiram of Tyre called up all the masons of the land, a lot of those masons were the Sumerians. And then the more refined, the more finished masons, what they call the freehand masons, basically came from this group of the Gibim, that basically worshipped Nimrod in essence. But when you follow the Judaic form back, they also go back to Nimrod building the Tower of Babel and Peleg as the architect. And Nimrod was Nim Amud, him who makes things. He was said to be the first maker of bricks. The Freemasons say that he was one of the first masons, I believe, with Peleg. But then when you get into the building of Solomon's temple, both of these groups of masons, essentially, which kind of gets into later times where they say Jesus was a carpenter. There's some historians that believe it's mistranslated, and it should say that he was a stone mason, getting back to the stone that the builder refused, right? But as far as the Jewish line or the Noahic line of Zadok Masons that were in the early times of Noah, going around the Dead Sea, practicing Kabbalah, meditating in caves. Basically, they were some of the first. They were the Rain Man. They were the first builders. And then you get into the Masons, and going back to this Phoenician culture, they basically brought this Noetic line and they brought this Phoenician line in together, right? And those were the builders of Solomon's temple. But from the Phoenician line, you had the lower block masons that basically cut the stone from the quarry and placed it. And then you had the freehand masons, which basically were the finishers, were the ones that did all the fine work and the carvings and all the things like you see in the modern cathedrals, right? But that freehand mason line split from the Samaritan line and basically became the Dionysian mystery cults, eventually becoming the cult of Bacchus, and then following into the cult of Liber Pater after the fall of Rome, which I believe became the cathedral builders. But then you have at the temple of Zerubbabel, the second temple, when they're trying to rebuild the temple, that the Samaritans actually come and they're like, we helped build the first temple. We want to help you do this. And Zerubbabel actually says to the Samaritans, he's like, are you the finished masons of Solomon of the days of old? And because Zerubbabel knew that they weren't. So you had this diametric, and this is why the Samaritans consistently tried to get in with the temple system, and even at times took over the temple system when the Jews were exiled. And then they just kind of fade away and get mixed in with the different Persian and the different Babylonian kind of diaspora. But you have the one side coming forth into modern day. And I wonder, in regard to the Ashkenazis versus the the genetic lines of what Judaism is and the different types of Jews, leads me to wonder whether or not the modern Zionists are just the crown, working to create dialectic within the world for the problem reaction solution function. You know what I mean? But I think those two diametric lines are the reason you see Kabbalah and the Tree of Life in both Judaism and within Freemasonry.
Okay, that was an amazing response to a very big question. And so I have two, I guess, comments and one question. One is I agree with you on Zionism. I tend to see it as like an ideological kind of like a dialectical arrow. So I don't necessarily think that everyone who adheres to it is like in some kind of cabal of, I just think it's more of an ideological faction. And like all ideological factions, it tends to absorb people who are more marginal or on the sidelines, or for whatever reason align with this faction or that faction. But I agree with you. I think it's completely like this kind of like discordant, chaotic ideology that is very disruptive, very, it causes a lot of strife. And I don't just mean war. I mean, I think ideological strife, political strife, how we discuss it, how like the terms that we have to use to describe it, that it's describe its functions. But unlike some people, I do not fully blame Zionism as a whole category or whole episteme as being like corrosive. That is not the only, I think that's just the first density. And I think that there's, like you said, I think it's actually more related to like that Anglo-Dutch kind of like continuum that sort of people don't, like, yes, people obviously talk about King Charles and the royal, I think it's the Royal York Masons, and and you and I spoke a little bit about David Icke, and then like 2 weeks later, he was saying something that I thought was like absolutely stupid. So yeah, and I think that is kind of like the function. I think it is to make these kinds of, you align with someone on one issue, and then they say something so outrageous or so like just like illogical or so outside of their previous kind of position, and I think that causes a lot of chaos. I think that's very discordant. So that's what I'll say about Zionism. I do agree with you on, okay, so in terms of Masonry, especially like American Freemasonry, do you think that the Manly P. Hall kind of like reintroduction of these kind of like mystery rites and forgotten rites and Hebrew Kabbalah, although I'm not very schooled in Manly, I only know, I mean, I have like a cursory understanding. I've read like one of his books, but I'm not like, some people have really deep dived into it.
Yeah, I have.
Okay, I think I kind of knew you did. So I was that's what I want to ask you, is that do you think that plays a bigger role in the introduction of like, or reintroduction of kind of like this magical thinking, this kind of like dialectical alchemy that exists in modern Freemasonry? Or do you think that there were people who remembered, who understood the tree, who could see the pillars, who could see the planets, who could see the Sephirah, who could see all of that, and who understood it, but they kind of let the like outer members forget it, but then they brought in Manly P. Hall to kind of reintroduce these ideas.
Right. And that was the thing, I don't know, when you get into there's Freemason documents, I want to say 700 years before the formation of the first Masonic lodge in England in 1717. But then you get into the Rosicrucian writings, which I feel have a huge influence, and
Yes. Yeah.
the Sabbatean philosophy was also spreading through Rosicrucian circles at the time. But it's diametrically interesting how these ideas have been spun and respun. There's some that believe that even the story of Osiris and Isis and the basically killing of Osiris is more of a newer tale that wasn't there in the beginning, and it's been some say reinforced by the Masons specifically. But yeah, it's the Masons. I believe there was a time when these ideas were highly suppressed with the rise of the Catholic Church. And if you get into God's little spies, and basically how you have the Jesuits going against the crown, and it becomes very interesting in regard to what these stories are and who interprets them. And like you were saying, Manly P. Hall basically came in at a point where the Masons themselves didn't understand their mysteries. And then you have Arthur Edward Waite as well coming in and basically providing us with the Masonic Encyclopedia and a few different Masonic writings. But Arthur Edward Waite was also into a vast amount of esoteric
Yes.
philosophy. He was translating grimoires. He was translating the Bohemian Tarot, which is the oldest book on the tarot. And then you get into Manly P. Hall and being a theosophist, which is basically a Luciferian, tying in with Madame Blavatsky, which her coming out of Italy with Mussolini and being one of the red shirts, which was a precursor to the brown shirts. I almost wonder on what level Madame Blavatsky was co-opted. As far as the whole theosophy movement, especially when you get into the fact that Madame Blavatsky came to the United States and married a U.S. senator that was in charge of looking at sugarcane and how they could turn sugar into a commercial product. When you get into nutrition and sugars being slow poisons, I just wonder about, my mind is very conspiratorial, just because
Let it out, Robby. It's totally
yeah,
fine. Be
just
that
because,
moment. Oh,
yeah, I know that power sources seek to manipulate, and that's just the nature of the reality that we live in. And yeah, but it's very interesting when you go back to Blavatsky and you look at her secret doctrine and you get into her Isis Unveiled, and you look at how a lot of that philosophical stuff basically translated into the blood and the soil and the rise of the esoteric Nazis within the SS and the Vril Society, and then you bring that forward to Manly P. Hall in the modern age, as far as the theosophists. It is a very intriguing question to wonder if that is a new way to spin a certain type of metaphysics into the current dogma that is becoming. Yeah, it's a very good question.
well, thank you. But I have this very antagonistic and I would actually go so far as to say that I hate theosophy. But when I
Mm,
say hate theosophy, it is because I necessarily hate all of its doctrines or ideas. I just think it is exact. I think the doctrine of theosophy is allegorical to the
mm,
corpse of Osiris.
yeah.
And I think that you kind of, with theosophy, you have a Frankenstein monster
Yes.
that sort of grows up in the place of a god. And you have a lot of inversion, a lot of
Mm,
subversion.
right.
And but then you also have truth, and that is the difficult thing for me, because it does tell things that are very interesting. And then you have people that came after, like Alice Bailey, or who
Yep.
were like, and she
Well, but
really
now
was
Alice
revolutionary.
Bailey, yeah, she was involved in the changing images of man, which became MK Ultra.
Exactly. And that's the problem with theosophy, is that it is touching a metaphysical truth. It's even articulating some kinds of metaphysical truths. Now, whether they are crystalline or, polluted by the perceptions, conceptions, all of that of others, I think that that's probably more likely the latter. But I also think that you do have this. It's sort of like Foucault. It's like, yes, he did write on biopower. Yes, he did talk about state surveillance. That's all true. But
Right.
then you have him as like a figure, and just like Bailey, who are kind of vehicles and vessels for state ideology
Right.
and for very transgressive kinds of state ideology and state oppression. And I
Mm.
think that it makes a lot of sense, even having Blavatsky coming out of Italy with the red shirts, because all the Mussolini faction were former Marxists. I mean,
Right.
even Evola himself was
Yes.
a former Marxist. So you just cannot kind of escape this idea of, I kind of always think of it like very Lurianic Kabbalah, like the vessels are created, and the vessels are kind of these forms of ideas, these names of ideas. So Marxism is just one like outer vessel. It's like the
Mm.
a clay, right? It's like a clay vessel that's like made by normal working class people, and you fill it with water.
Yep.
Then that is kind of the real identity of the vessel. So the real identity you can't tell from the external. You can't see if it's poison, or if it's water, or if it's polluted, or if it's clean. It just is in the vessel. And then that's what my problem with ideology is that there's always something much more nefarious in the inner layers,
Right.
and much more mad.
And when you get into Marx, basically taking the tenets of the Catholic Church and making them secular, turning them into tenets of communism itself. And then, you get into using communism and it was formulated specifically around a capitalist market. And you almost have to wonder how much of a weapon it was, specifically in regard to the rise of the United States itself. But the fact that Marxism is set up as a stair step system, from capitalism to socialism to communism, and we can see cases where capitalist countries have turned socialist, like when Lenin, basically changed the National Socialist Party to the National Communist Party when he got off the Iron Train. The dialectic as far as the function, and all the think tanks say that capitalism and communism are the two easiest ideas to merge. Even though one is a money system and one is a governmental system. But the fact that it's based off the tenets of the church and secularized. And then we know also from Reuters, I think in 2014, they put an article out that it was the Rothschilds that basically paid Marx to write the Communist Manifesto. And the Rothschilds we also see as the same force behind generating the modern state of Israel with the Balfour Declaration, reinforced by the backing of the crown.
I mean, I agree with you, Robbie. There's no, like, that is a history that's really indisputable. Now, I
Mm.
think what is interesting, obviously, I tend to look at Asia, so I tend to think of like Ho Chi Minh,
Yep.
studying with the Paris anarchists, and
Right.
also the other group called the Tokyo anarchists. And they weren't. I'm saying the word anarchist because that's how they self-described. I'm not calling them anarchists. They
Right.
weren't really anarchists. They were really funded by these kind of dark money, what we would call
Yeah.
like a dark money pacts, that were funded by like special interests, maybe European interests, maybe colonial interests, maybe banking interests. There's a wide variety of people who obviously are interested in funding the dialectic. So I think that is very interesting. I think that also Vietnam is interesting in the like de-evolution from a kind of full communism into a kind of market socialism. I think that's a very interesting case study. I think that the fact that they don't get along with China is also
Mm,
very interesting. But then they are also closely allied with the US. So
right.
that, right, like Mark said, there's always these like major, glaring, huge, like gaping contradictions
Yeah.
in not just in history, but also in people's perceptions of history. Like
Yes.
everybody is always like, oh, Vietnam, like they just like, they're just ready to move on from the war. And then you have this other side. Oh, excuse me, sorry about that.
No, no. Well, and that's the thing with Vietnam. When you get into Vietnam, my dad was just over there, and they have the War Museum from Vietnam, and it has, all the American soldiers' hands that they cut off preserved in jars. It had, so yeah, I mean, war is hell, just period. And when you get into Vietnam and Korea, and specifically the state organization of the drug cartels, or the furthering of the money powers coming out of the opium wars, and just the fact that they were airlifting rice into Korea and Vietnam so they could grow poppies, so they could, basically keep these opium wars, these soft mechanistic wars, going throughout the world. It is, yeah, it's very, um, it's the more you awaken to history, the more you become concerned for the future generations, which personally is why I think that the ideas of free speech, the ideas of liberty, the ideas of, these cosmic ideas that align through the ages, are kind of, you know, really one of the more important things we have, as far as, the Magna Carta and the sovereignty of the individual themselves.
I totally agree with you, Robbie, and thank you for carrying me with the dog barking.
Oh, yeah.
Um, but I no, I completely agree. I think you made an amazing point about the nature of the Vietnam and Korean War, and also the genocide in Indonesia. And people know who follow me. My dad's from Indonesia, ethnic Chinese, but from Indonesia. And so this is honestly like the whole history of Southeast Asia. I feel like is very opaque, is very mystified. But it really, if you were going to break it down to one kind of like working idea of what it has been about for like the last 400 years, I think the history of medicine and drugs is the history of Southeast Asia, and that is
Yeah.
something I'd like to explore more, and especially, but in particular of Vietnam. And also, interestingly enough, and I'll go back to Vietnam, but I think it's interesting to also note, and I always try and note this, is that during the Vietnam War is when the modern, so there was obviously pre-modern transgender surgeries happening
Right.
in Europe, in France, and Andorra, and Weimar Germany.
Germany, and yep,
Yes,
yep.
yes, and all of those Western European countries. However, the modern version of the surgery was pioneered in Thailand during the Vietnam War.
Mm,
Thailand was used as a base of like I forgot what it's called, but it's like a leisure time where they would let the GIs kind of like vacation on their like free
on
days.
the right.
And so it became, that is when Thailand, even though it has that really strong association with sex tourism now, I think it's very interesting to look at when that kind of history started. And it
Started.
really started then, although obviously, Bangkok was founded and funded by Chinese traders,
Yep. And
right? So
opium money. Yep.
exactly. So you have this long history of like the Southeast Asian kind of sex trade, but then it really intensifies and really changes during the Vietnam War. And
Yeah.
then you have that surgery exported to Brazil,
Mm,
which had a fascist kind of like military junta dictator at the time. And then also to, interestingly enough, Iran. So
mm,
there's a lot of threads that like these conflicts, and like you said, war is hell. I am 100% like, I am on the side of liberty, and I am like, I would say I'm a libertarian, but I do not really enjoy libertarians as like a collective. like, but as a party like ideology, I don't
Yeah.
like that. But I am like, I agree with like 99% of the things, and I'm
Yeah.
totally down with liberty, natural law, the idea of like even the codification of that and like the Magna Carta. I agree with all of that. But to go back to Vietnam, I think that the idea is it's all about opium. I think even interestingly enough, Crowley was even in the region in Burma and Yunnan. Well, that's what they said for that specific reason. And I think that I think Madame Blavatsky was also there for like similar region, for similar reasons.
Right. Right.
So
Um, Yeah, and it's interesting, looking at Blavatsky, and then that whole time when they were actually, trying to create the new Messiah, to create the new Messianic or Masonic age, and Crowley going in, to South America for the, getting the British the oil, and Agent 666, and just looking at his movements, even when he came to the United States, in upstate New York. He was hanging out basically in Bethel, New York, which is where they ended up having Woodstock. And just ties in with rock and roll, being with the Beatles, Sergeant Pepper, basically releasing it 20 years to the day after Crowley had died. And then the song is, it was 20 years ago today, Sergeant Pepper taught the band to play. And he's the only figure that's on the cover of that Sergeant Pepper's album twice, once as a youth and once as an elder. It just, the intelligence aspects, tying in from OSS to CIA to Tavistock to just all the machinations that have been spun to the Esalen Institute, to all these miscellaneous forces that have worked to manipulate the psyche of the masses. And I don't think it's anything new,
no, it's definitely not new. And I think to go back to something you said, I think all roads, I've said this to you before, so if people are listening, I'm sorry, but all roads always lead to Babylon, in my
Yep.
opinion. I think that that's true for Tantra. I think that's true for the Himalayan regions. I think that's true for Southeast Asia. People forget Southeast Asia used to be a Hindu Buddhist kind of like empire, several of them for like over 1,000, maybe 1,500 years. So there's an element of all of these kinds of traditions, threads, esotericism that lead back to Babylon. Interestingly enough, 666, as I'm sure you know, Robbie, is the planetary number of the sun. This is
Correct.
true for both Western magic as well as Vedic astrology, Jyotish.
Mm.
And Crowley did write the book, The Star Ruby.
Yep.
Interestingly enough, in the Al Kitab, which is a Arabic grimoire from the 10th century. Well, I shouldn't say Arabic. It is written in Arabic, but it's a Mughalized Arabic. So it
Mm.
was the Persian rulers who ruled India in that time had this book written called Al Kitab, which is based on a earlier. We don't quite know. There's a discrepancy if it's written in like an earlier, more Indianized form, or if it's an Arabic translation. We don't know. But anyways, Star Ruby is considered to be the gemstone of the star, or excuse me, the gemstone of the sun. So I just
Right.
think you do have these kind of reoccurrent, again, perennial themes, especially with him, and but also this idea of the sun as kind of the emperor of state rights. Like you have Louis the Sun King. You have a lot of these people as having like these solar connotations, and I will just say like the
All
physical,
Invictus.
exactly, Sol Invictus. And you have this, and I know you just did a show on Mithras with Lee,
Yep.
which is a particular interest of mine as well, because in Dharma we do have a goddess who is associated with the secret treaty. And we don't have to get into that, but I think that is very interesting when we're talking about Mithras, what
Mm.
Mitzvah means in the Avestan, which is treaty or covenant or
Covenant.
contract,
Right. Right.
right? And then also back to the capstone, who owns the covenant? Who controls the covenant? Who is the covenant with? And I mean that in both terms, like which God is the covenant with and which
Right.
people is the covenant with, and
With. Yeah.
where was it signed? Because I think that is also a very interesting question.
Yeah. And when you start looking at covenants, it's interesting between Yahweh moving in, from the Elohim to Yahweh to Yadhe Vadhe. The covenants of the Abrahamic tradition have been broken and reestablished, and broken and reestablished, and it's a, and when the people that the covenant are made with backslide and go against the rules that the covenant was set up on, that's why you see this constant reinitiate. And it's interesting that it's these energetic forces that are considered as godheads, and I think honestly, if it's something that's communicating with people, that it's a piece of the Godhead, just like we are a piece of the Godhead. But I think that the Godhead itself, when you get into Kether and rising above, that it got the Godhead is everything. And I, by that factor, I think maybe it may be working to resolve the whole, but I don't think it has necessarily the mechanisms of needing to communicate with us.
You're speaking my language here, Robbie. So I know we're both both of us are a little bit Kether heads. Obviously, Buddhism prefers outside the tree or outside the cube, depending on how you want to describe that. Like ejection from Kether, that's kind of the idea, into the three other higher worlds,
Right.
which are no returner realms, which means that you don't get stuck back into the cycle of samsaric rebirth as a human. Now, of course, we have to also mention that, like the theosophy, Alice Bailey, Blavatsky, and Crowley, and many of the more left-hand path post-war magicians do prefer the 11th sphere, Dath, as kind of their principal sphere. So, in my opinion, I don't think I think that Dath exists in a way, in a metaphysical way. But I also think that should not be, that's a sphere of magic. That's a sphere of bringing the lightning strike back down from the Godhead.
Correct. Yep.
And it is not, that should not be, we should aim higher. We should have the higher goal. Like we should face Kether upward facing, much like Vajra Yogini. I'm quite fond of her. Anyone who follows me will know that I am. And, I think that it's important. I think it's really important. And I also think that what you said was incredible. I think that the Godhead is not necessarily communicating with us directly. I think that's totally true.
Right.
And I think that the one thing I really appreciate about like the Dharmic religions, whether you're talking about Santana Dharma, what we call Hinduism, Buddhism, I'm just starting to explore Jainism now. I'm just like starting to kind of like pierce what it is and what it means and what they believe. And that's very difficult to do, obviously, as an outsider, but I'm trying. But I think that they resolve this kind of like paradox, and it is called the tantric paradox. Some writers have described it as that, as like this kind of dialogic process between the eminent and the transcendent, and which one is it? Is it Shakti? Is it Shiva? Is it Buddha? Is it higher? Is it the Adi Buddha, like the primordial consort and the primordial Buddha? And so that's more my thinking of it, is like it's a very Gnostic story, and people are often surprised by how Gnostic, especially Tantric Buddhism is, and the idea of a sort of like a primary consort of the primordial million years ago, consort of the light. She hears the cries of whatever people or souls or whatever, or she's curious. Sometimes that's also how it's described, is that she's curious about the other side of the mirror.
Right.
Falls down, and she sort of, through her fall, but we don't really describe it as a fall, but I'm just going to use that description. But she falls through and creates sort of the materialization of material reality through light, is the idea. And then the primordial consort, the male consort, he's kind of at the top, and he's pristine consciousness. Like he's like without any quality. He is the lightning strike, but he's not lightning in our phenomenological way. Like he's not the lightning that appears in a storm, but he is that consciousness, like just total Zen, total naturalness, just like pure in the world, or not really in the world, but above the world. And it's she who responds. But then there's also the idea, and I think this goes back to your amazing series on Isis and Osiris, that she is a witch in one way of thinking, and she can sort of pull God in a form down to participate. So we also would consider that like the Mahakala, or like the Time King, or like a Shiva, but like not the Shiva that you normal people see just meditating with his eyes closed. But when Shiva becomes Bhairava, or the ferocious one, then he is like active in the world. And through Bhairava, then you get the hero, Vishnu, and then the cycle can sort of, reset and then complete itself at the same time. So there's some really interesting resolutions of the paradox. I don't know, maybe people don't find that to be satisfactory, but for me, whenever I've heard you discuss it, I've always thought, okay, well, Tantra explains it in this way. It's not even at odds at all. It's actually the same story. It's just that they're thinking of it in a kind of more, in like a different way. Like, I think there were, like you said, like it's a wheel of time. People sort of went in the different directions of the world. They took the, seeds of the ideas, and they brought it to their respective homelands, and then or the lands they made their homes, and they sort of, manifested the ideas in like state religion, in like codified religion, in codified text, in different ways. So there was different kinds of ways, different dialectical processes that contributed to kind of the understanding of what it became. And I think that the Enlightenment thinkers, I'm gonna let you speak. I'm sorry, I'm going on forever. But the Cartesian dualism, I think for me, is the biggest kind of flaw in sort of the Western Enlightenment thinking, because I see that as very poisonous. This like strong distinction between things, strong distinction between people, and strong distinction between sort of like these metaphysical higher concepts and like the physical world. I don't think that the distinction is that great, and I think it's a conversation, like it's a dialectical conversation that is happening. And if you perceive both objects as being completely different from each other, being completely removed, it even makes conversation very difficult to happen. So you cannot really engage in these spiritual, metaphysical, and worldly processes that are so important to human health.
And that is the function of the dialectic in itself, is to, it's people always say, the Orwellian playbook, being divide and conquer, and when you get into words and definitions of words and how we see them changing the definitions of words, in essence, it's a way to control the fundamental building blocks of what reality is. And when you say that, red is blue, or red is red and blue is blue, and that they don't cross in between, where if we look at the color wheel, we can see that there's that purple that's in between, that ultraviolet, that infrared kind of, color that kind of persists in the wavelength, that the fringes of color itself, that's where they don't want you to delve. They don't want you to delve in those areas that are amorphous, that are, where the systems overlap. And when you get into, like you were saying, the libertarian kind of, in ways is disturbing, how some people perceive and take it. But libertarianism is part of the dialectic of liberty. So within that, you have the liberal on one side, and you have the libertarian on the other side. And when you wrap those all the way around on the back, they start to cross over one another. And people don't understand that it is a circular system that is divided through a dialectic. Which is meant to cause derision, chaos. But like we were talking in the beginning of the show, as far as coming at things from an adversarial point of view, the dialectic itself becomes the adversary. And is that a necessary function on a cosmic level for these thought forms to hash themselves out in like a kind of an eternal passion play. You know what I mean?
I mean, I agree with you. I think that the point about violet and like dark purple and the meeting of blue and yes, blue and red is amazing. I think that obviously I'm going to use a tantric Buddhist example is that the primordial consort is called Samanta Badri, so all that is good in the world or all that is good in the Godhead. So when they are together, it's perfect. It's like it's the Godhead at absolute perfection, absolute naturalness,
Right.
absolute beauty. Like there's no quality, but there's a quality of compassion and love.
Yes.
Then when she comes down, she becomes Ekajati. So people who follow me on Twitter will know that I often do post on Ekajati. She's one of my I'm very fascinated with her. She is sometimes depicted as having a wolf's head. She has three eyes, but two of her eyes are blind, and she has her third eye. And the idea is the sound without view. So why am I bringing her up? Is that she is also Samanta Badri. So she is ferocious. She eats corpses. She's eating the heart of a what's called like a warlock, like a transgressive sorcerer in one hand, and she has like a corpse popsicle in the other hand. And she's a very powerful. She liberates time. That's the idea. She liberates
Right.
the corpse of time by destroying it. She completely
Right.
annihilates it. But the why her eyes are blind, her material eyes are blind, so she does not destroy the world. It's not anti-cosmic in like that sense. Like she comes down, she does her thing, and she goes. And yes, it is disruptive. And yes, it is, she kind of maybe you could say she burns away the old covenant.
Right.
And through her wolf howl, or what is really it's the secret meaning is that she's speaking kind of the words of unmaking creation, secret mantra. So when we take those seeds or those words that she's saying and we use them as people or matrons or sorcerers or whatever, we have to be very careful that we adhere to the new covenant. That is kind of the idea. So I do think, and like then if you think of her as also being Samanta Badri, that means that when she is at Kether or beyond Kether, she is the Violet Mother. She is mother who resolves paradox. And in many ways, I find the tantric consort, this idea of like God as one, but also two,
Right.
that is a resolution of paradox.
Or even three.
Well, the three is really important because you cannot really have worldly God. Like the God of pristine quality cannot really be in the world. He has to kind of be brought in through the eminent force, which is obviously assigned the female. So but I do feel like that resolves some of the paradox that happens with more of the European mythologies. I don't know how you feel about it, Robbie.
Yeah, the Trinity, dualism, but I think that as life is a multiplicity, so our understandings are a multiplicity. So as far as when you get into the monotheistic idea versus the polytheistic idea, pantheism, all these things are expressing ideas of the natural world and how things turn and function and how we participate or ascend above these things.
100%.
So, it's and again that becomes a dialectic within itself.
No, I agree, and I have always described like deity yoga, like what we do in Tantric Buddhism, as a dialectical process, because it's not like Hinduism where the deity is necessarily outside of you. There's also like there's three layers, right? Like it's like a secret trinity kind of like there's an inner layer, outer a secret layer. So there is a deity that is outside, and then there's also a deity that's inside, and there's also a deity that is co-created between the two. So it's at the point of synthesis. So
yes,
right, and synthesis usually happens inside of you. So however people want to kind of like articulate that, like if it's psychological, I mean that's one way. I think that's a limited way, but I mean you can say that. And,
yeah.
so but I also think like you're totally right, and I think for me lately, I don't know, sometimes I change, like sometimes I'm more monistic, sometimes I'm more non-theistic. I kind of like and Buddhism does allow for both of those things,
Right.
like Tantra Buddhism. Like it allows for you to kind of have these more nebulous relationships. Obviously, we do believe in the existence of spirits, and the
Mm.
existence of like Garudas and Nagas and like
Right.
ghosts, hell, and like different realms. Obviously, all of that. But we also kind of like have this more nebulous relationship when it comes to the immanent gods, and not
Mm.
in the sense of the consort, but maybe in the sense of like the polytheism. Like Buddhism's not really polytheist in the broader understanding of that word. It's
Right.
much more mystic. It's much more looking at it as like emanating from the single cosmic Buddha at the top of the tree, beyond the tree.
Mm.
And, you know, everything that happens, it happens for us to kind of climb back up.
Right.
And those are what the whole point of using like the mantras, using the tools, using the vajra, using the purva, using all the, you know, ritual implements, is that's what it's for. It's the meeting of wisdom and method, chokma and bana. So you're
Mm.
meeting that and you're creating the synthesis every single time that you're doing the performance of ritual and practice. So I just think, yeah, I mean, I have a hard time with it because I definitely have like a strong theistic tendency in myself, and I've never
Right.
tried to excise it, or like I've never rebelled against it or anything like that. But I just sometimes I do wonder how useful it is for people to be overly reliant on that, because obviously in Buddhism
Mm.
we do describe it as when people call out to God, God falls down.
Mm.
So is it useful for people to call on God, and then we are again we are doing another cycle being trapped in samsara? This is a
Right.
kind of perennial question, and it's obviously much greater than our dialogue, but I just think that it's interesting to think about, and I wonder about it myself.
Yeah. And well, and it's interesting coming from the perspective of being raised with really no religion. I was taught right or wrong. I was taught, to be honest, and the golden rule as far as treat others how you wanted to be treated. But then as I got older, I became curious about these things. And the way I kind of look at it, as far as from an internal landscape, is that all of these ideas are relevant, just due to the fact that within the cultures that they existed, they had relevancy in regarding to creating their own energetic force. So I feel like almost like all of these philosophies are part of the expansion and fractaline turning of the tree. So as you take in any of these philosophies, you understand the dark, you understand the light, you see all the different schisms and splits and all the different, and you don't disbelieve it, but you don't believe it. And on a certain level, once it's that idea that once you believe something, that your quest for knowledge has ended, because you have crystallized that information, which is itself, when you look at the word, it's information. It's all this exterior knowledge that you're processing within, all these different dialectical aspects, and you're creating a synthesis within yourself. So and I think it's like a plant. It's ever evolving, it's ever growing, it's ever, putting off new leaves and blossoming, and like creating seeds and new ideas forming, and it's very alchemical, cosmic, in many ways to me, as far as how I see this stuff.
No, obviously I chose Buddhism as my like primary philosophical, maybe ontological system for this
Hmm.
exact reason. And people might not understand what I'm saying when I say like discard ideology, but yes, I do practice a specific religion. The whole idea of Dharma is that we use the system that has worked for other people, and
Right.
we adhere to the cosmic treaty. And yes, we do like there are a moral kind of implications to different things, and there's like the three gems and the eightfold path and all of that.
Mm.
But the idea is that Dharma is multifaceted. Dharma is many paths, many yanas that
Right.
appear and disappear. And then I also brought this up in a previous episode about Karl Jaspers, the German sociologist who studied Buddhism.
Mm.
Many of the early Tibetologists, Sanskritologists were Anglos and Germans, so it's
Right.
very interesting. And he studied Buddhism as kind of an axial age, Bronze Age religion, and sort of his conclusion at the end of like his 30, 40 years of study and like excavation and archaeology in Afghanistan and India is that he believed that Buddhism was kind of an axial age religion in a greater cosmic idea, that it appeared when people needed it to appear, this idea of dharma, what it is, the respect of the treaty, the understanding of karma, the understanding of like our samsaric rebirths, and it would sort of fade out in the rise of monotheism or monism as people kind of, I guess, the tree kind of expanded itself, and that people's like lives became more complicated by the state, by different familial kind of arrangements, different kind of social arrangements. But really the truth is that like the karma is perennial, dharma is perennial. There is a cosmic cycle outside of us, but then also inside of us. So what I'm trying to say in an articulate way is that I agree with everything that you said, and I think it's complicated because it's so easy to look outside of ourselves. Like it's so easy for me to look at Twitter or whatever the discourse is or the news. I don't watch the news, but you know,
Yeah.
I know you're more on that. Like with me, it's hard. It's very difficult, and like
Yeah.
to put ideas into something else is I've come to realize is kind of like is very there is something very magical about that, very alchemical, very like when you put it into celebrities, when you put it into
Mm.
politics, when you put it into like externalizations,
Right. Right.
who are kind of feeding that. You're feeding the egregore. I know some people describe it as that. And you are also feeding its reality, like its creation into reality, its crystallization.
Right. And I think kind of the reason that I pay attention to politics and really try to call out some of the dastardly things going on in this realm is once you have children and you're vested in raising this soul and bringing it in to this world and trying to show it beauty, then you have a concern on a higher cosmic level of the maturity of passing your genes of your ancestors through the time space continuum, and you want your children um to have freedom and liberty and be able to kind of exist in a wholesome manner within the realm itself. So in I mean, ultimately, I've just always been an information junkie, and I don't see any difference in how the modern history works in comparison to the ancient history.
Agreed.
It's just the modern dialectic, the modern turning of the age old story. Yeah. So, but no, I do sometimes worry that I am feeding into that beast system, the vampiric Babylon system. But at the same time, um, in regard to my own cosmic function, liberty, and freedom, I kind of look at the idea of Mithra is, you want to shine a light on some things while simultaneously, maintaining the dagger to pierce the cosmic reality.
100%, 100%. I totally agree. Also, just to bring circle back around to Ekajati, she only has a single fang that is used to pierce the skull of people to introduce light. It's not a
Mm,
story where she uses like to physically pierce the people's skull, but it's an
no, I know.
idea, right? It's just a metaphor for
Yeah,
this exact thing that you're saying. It's kind of like the liberation of the hidden knowledge, a liberation of
right.
hidden light, just very Mithric. So, and I agree with you. We have to speak to the things that need speaking about because that is sort of like I think every human is like a mage. Every human is like an alchemist if they choose to be.
If they choose, yeah.
Right? And well, if you know your own will, you're a lot more efficacious, right? Your magic is a lot more powerful.
For sure.
So most people don't seem to know their own will, however.
I know.
However, there are people that seem to have more of a grasp of what that is and what that means and a way to like weaponize it. And I don't mean in like a negative way, but a weapon can also be used for protection. A weapon can also be used for good. Like you can, liberty has to sometimes be fought for. So I think that we do need to do that. I think that that's part of our cosmic function. And we also are co-creative. Like we choose to turn the wheel of the cosmos in either a cosmic or anti-cosmic direction. That's
Right.
very
Right.
clear in the tantric texts. Very clear that the way we act, the way we pre-configure our societies, the kinds of systems we have, the kinds of beliefs we have, that all influences the way the axis turns.
Right.
So
But when you get into this idea of piercing the skull and bringing illumination, and how that falls into the ideas of luciferianism, and how these ideas of liberty, equality, fraternity, basically are a moving away from the monistic aspect of what the crown has symbolized as the Godhead on earth. Some of the fundamental Christians, like Eastern Orthodox Christians, believe that a monarchy would be the best thing as far as a wise philosopher king ruling over the whole. But unfortunately, human, is a corrupt entity just because of the nature of the existence of what reality is. And we see the corruption in the higher levels over and over and over. And also the turning of darker magic within a lot of these higher crown and governmental functions as well. So yeah, when you get into, and that's again, that creates a whole, and I hate to keep saying dialectic, but the idea of liberty is opposed to monarchy. And liberty, in regard to illumination or the Illuminati, can be seen as a perverse function against monarchy. But if the realm that we're living in is an inverted aspect of a higher realm, then on a certain level, we have to invert certain things to work in the proper manner.
I agree with you, Robbie. I think you made amazing points. Now, I am interested in this idea of anarcho-monarchism. I know that sounds very
Mm,
esoteric and like niche Twitter, and it is. But I do think there is something to Plato and his idea of the philosopher king. I know that
right.
you've done amazing shows on the Hittite kings of Egypt and many other kings, in fact, and Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar and Nimrod, obviously.
Yeah.
And I do think that there's something very interesting in this idea of a benign kinghead or benign like monarchy. I think
Mm,
there's something interesting about it. I don't know how it would function. I'm not a huge democracy enjoyer
mm,
myself, just because I think I'm against the idea of the fractalization of society in this,
right.
that we divide ourselves by ideological, racial, sex, like all the categories, right? Like
All the
I
categories.
right, I'm more libertarian in that way, more Luciferian maybe. That
Mm,
I do believe in like those, like maybe the trinity of the principles that you stated, and I do think that I just don't know exactly how a formation could work that is both. I think monism is probably the better solution rather than like monotheism, and I
mm,
think, but I don't mean that in the one world government kind of
right.
way,
Right.
right? But it's a
Well,
paradox, right?
yeah, because that's the thing. When you go back to the idea of novus ordo seclorum, coming out of Virgil, It's the idea, and you get into the cosmic cycles in regard to the Veda, as far as what is it, how you sink down into involution, and we're currently in what's the time block called in Hinduism?
Kali Yuga.
The Kali Yugas, yes, yes. And that essentially through time we eventually rise back up. And when you get into Norvis Ordo Seclorum and the idea of they're trying to recreate a cosmic cycle on the earthly plane through the formation of a one world government. But the thing is, because of the nature of the corrupted aspect of the crystallization, it's a utopian philosophy. And when you get into the word utopia itself, it means nowhere. It's something that doesn't exist, that
Right.
that
Right.
can never happen, just because it's an ideal, you know. And again, ideals are corrupted, weaponized, created, and turned into dialectic for the purpose of control.
No, you're 100%, and we are coming up to time, but I do want to touch on two really interesting things and get kind of your perspective on it before we end. Is so first, I want to just touch on the idea of these kind of like anti-cosmic, or we'll call them black magic cults that
Mm,
exist in the Society of the Elect, or the Hearers, or whatever you want to call it, but in the elite caste.
the
So
L.
the L, exactly. So I do think that that is very true, but I think that they also are subject to karma. They are also
Yes.
subject to the dharmic laws. They cannot, regardless of how much black magic you invoke, you cannot just burn away the dharmic treaty because you want to. It doesn't work like that. It's never worked like that. You can do it, but all you end up doing is externalizing it, making society
Right.
more diverse. You don't actually do anything at the higher cosmic cycle. So
Right.
you exactly like what you said. It's kind of like the degradation of the crystallization.
Yes.
So, right, like they can just make the world worse, but they can't actually, they don't influence the higher order.
Right.
And so I think that's why been my whole thing, especially because when I heard you do the series on the Emerald Tablets, I realized what there's a Kalachakra teaching that the humans in the next yuga, so after the Kali Yuga, which we are now moving out of currently, like we're still in it, and we might,
Oh yeah.
depends on whose interpretation, but we have like 100 years to 50 years to 10 years to 5 years. It obviously depends. But
Yeah. I've even heard 250,000 up to left that we're still in.
I think that the math, like the way that they translated the Sanskrit, was incorrect. I think that
Mm,
the yugas are much shorter, but I do think it depends on the yuga and the kalpa, which are the
yeah.
4 quadrant units in each yuga. So I do think that they are much shorter than what the Vedas are said to say.
Mm.
That's my opinion, obviously, but I'm not alone in that.
Or is
And
that a moon calendar versus a sun calendar?
well, that's the whole thing, is that the Vedic astrology does have both things, right?
Right.
Like the
Right.
Nisha system of the lunar phases is very important, especially to Tantra, especially to understanding the influence on the world. That is something that is very, very important. And that
Mm.
is obviously represented in the Sri Yantra. So the 4 upward facing and the 5 downward facing triangles all in one, and then you have like a 64 kind of like triangles within that
Oh yeah.
formation.
I've seen that.
So
I've seen that.
yes, exactly. So you know what I'm talking about. So I think that, yes, I think that I think it depends. I think it just depends.
Well, in regard to the L, the elect, um, it's when you look at the system of cosmic evolution, that is kind of this perennial idea that we kind of discuss. Part of the modern personification is the rise of transhumanism,
Hmm.
and this idea of creating yourself as a god. And this goes back to the builders of the Tower of Babel, how they were trying to get into that heavenly realm to get to the tree of life so that they could exist on the earthly plane without having to, die in their fleshly bodies. But when you look at going back to world leaders, Napoleon, he had a whole kind of campaign that he did that was the apotheosis of Napoleon, and this goes back, I've been trying to follow this back, but it's the idea of turning oneself into a god, and we have George Washington in the Capitol Dome here in the United States in the painting that's there, and he's inside of a circle, magic circle with 72 stars around it, with the natural elements surrounding him, and it's called the apotheosis of George Washington. And that Capitol Dome is Isis's pregnant belly birthing George Washington into the cosmic realm as a god. But as you bring this forward into the technocracy, you start to see that they're wanting to be able to create a simulacra of the reality that they can potentially upload themselves into. But that's the thing, it's a simulacra within a simulacra
That's
within a
right.
simulacra. It's not, it still doesn't dictate the cosmic and prolonged aspects of the movements of the eternal energies,
No, you're totally right, and I will just point out that you and I have made this connection in other times we've podcasted, but the Isis Tara, green Tara, specifically green Tara, connection is very strong. Tara is Lambodaraya, pregnant. Her stomach is filled with the waters of potential. It's filled with the god. So yeah, that's basically how it's envisioned.
Right.
Exactly the same. The god takes the 72 forms of the tetragrammaton, and he also takes and that's even true in tantra. So 72 becomes a very important number. It's the number of the Bhairavas. It's the
1 degree in the turning of the ages.
So exactly. So such an important thing. I know that there's particular emphasis placed on the sphere called Chesed, which is, interestingly enough, you and I discussed a little bit last night, as like a Jupiter kind of idea. And there's an idea that Jupiter is actually not the colors that they say it is, that it is more of it's like the color of an ocean. Like the ocean isn't really a color, but we do perceive it as being a color. So that's kind of the idea of Tara. And then there's certain teachings that say that Tara will be the mother of the next age or the next yuga, other than Kali, right?
Right.
So,
And that kind of goes along with the coming of the age of Aquarius,
right,
as far as moving into, and also as far as moving into the divine feminine energies, right? But also when you look at the fact that traditionally within Catholicism, it was the angel Michael that was the messenger that basically brought, the word to the different prophets. But then when you get to Muhammad, Gabriel is the one that comes and announces, the coming eon. And that movement from Michael to Gabriel, from what I can see, is also a movement from the patriarchal function to the matriarchal function. You know what I'm saying?
No, I totally agree. So if people want to look at equalatry, what Robbie's saying is basically Michael isn't a solar angel per se. He's more associated with Kether. However, he can be associated with the sun, so Tippereth.
Right.
And then Gabriel has the association with Yesod, which is the moon. Interestingly enough, Sephardic astrology places the moon as Malkuth. So there is something quite interesting there. Maybe you're talking about light descending. When we see it at the sun, we see this like martial kind of like the glory of the leader of the armies of the heavenly host. And then when the light descends down to Yesod, we see kind of like this more mellower, angel of sound, because that's kind of what Yesod is associated with, right? Like this, the vibrations of the universe. So there's something very interesting there, and that is the last thing I want to touch on is Age of Aquarius. And I
Mm,
will just say that I personally am a believer in the interpretation of the Aeon of the Daughter, and there
right.
are right, and so Aquarius is not green Tara. So Aquarius really becomes the pink daughter with
Mm,
green eyes,
the
who
pink
does
light.
fall at Yesod. So that's my interpretation. That's not just my interpretation, but that's a well-known interpretation of some of the texts.
Right.
So I do believe that. I do believe that we are entering like a. I think that their interpretation has a lot to do with false mercy. I think
Mm,
it has a lot to do with like the suffocation of society, like through policy,
yep.
through like authoritarianism, through. But it's like it's always couched in the terms of you must we must do this to save the planet. We must do this to save, our seniors. We must do this to do this. It's always couched in the terms of mercy.
It's well, and that's weaponized anthropology. When you
Exactly.
take a person's moral sense and use that to manipulate them for an end goal.
Exactly. But it's also the relationship that Chesed has in the later Kabbalah.
Yeah.
And it gets placed at kind of a Kether position. Like it will say that Jupiter is going to be the planetary ruler of the next Kalpa or Yuga. My interpretation is that we are doing this Pluto Aquarius thing right now, and that perfectly aligns with the Kalachakra teaching, like perfectly aligns with it.
Mm,
And it's kind of this moving away from the old forms, but it's also creating a new form. So it's not just like revivifying old forms. It's not a Frankenstein. It's
right.
not repeating, but it's kind of like introducing something brand new.
Yes.
I agree with you about the transhumanism. Like for me, that is a very subversive, transgressive, and not in a cool way. Ideology. It's very, it's very anti-human. It's very anti-cosmic, and
Yeah.
it's a very false world. It's a completely false world that they're intending to make. It's a refraction of a refraction
Yes.
into a black cube, right? And it's a kind of atheistic idea as well. Like not atheism where you necessarily are like rejecting God per se, but it's atheism in that you're believing that consciousness is the only thing that is the
That
governing force of the
exists.
world.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. It's I mean, and this all of this information, and people often ask me, well, why do you constantly go back to this old, like, these ancient texts and all these ancient stories? And it's the idea that if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And
100,
and and they count on that. That's why they burn books. That's why,
100.
and as far as Mao, being educated at Yale, you
Hmm.
know,
Hmm.
it just all folds over on itself. And I think it's necessary to have these philosophical understandings of the crystalline reality
Hmm.
and the cosmic reality, and how they interplay and work, and how these forms are used as dialectical weapons, weaponized anthropology, and it's just essential as part of being a developing human mind on the planet.
You're totally right, and I didn't really articulate it well, but when you did your series on the Emerald Tablets, that's what I realized is that
Mm,
the dialectical arrow is really under our control in many
right,
ways. The emerald is within us. In some ways, it's like, we have the power of the philosopher's stone within us with our
right,
discernment, with the naming of things, with what we call things, how honest we are. Not honest necessarily, but honest in that what we call things, are they real? Like, is it
right,
really real or is it ideologically real? Because
right,
there's a big difference between form and idea.
right. And
So,
that's when I get into like um, these ghost form machinations within the modern, political world in regard to Black Lives Matter, in regard to Antifa, in regard to these masked Nazis that are marching around the Capitol, and these what is it, the Proud Boys with their tiki torches. These are all ghost forms that are created to march around us to try to create a perception of reality so that they can nudge or push the function of something in one direction or another.
100%. 100% could not have said that better. It's all about the play in reality, how they play, how the elite, how the L class plays in reality. That is their spell. That is they're doing their Masonic ritual in public. They're not calling it a Masonic ritual. Doesn't even necessarily look like it. Obviously, smart people can see through it. But I'm not even saying that in like a self-aggrandizing way. I'm just saying that there is a way to see the colors. There's a way to see like what is really going on. There is a way to pierce through.
And that's the checkerboard floor, and I've traced that all the way back into ancient Armenia, and those colors, the black and white checkerboard floor that you see in the Masonic lodges, that's the color of the floor that you see when you're in the dark. When you're in the daytime, through the illumination of the mind, those colors are actually a powder blue and a scarlet red. But the thing is, when you have the wool pulled over your eyes, you only see the black and white, because it's a matter of working with cones or working with rods and the fundamental understanding of how the human perceives and processes information.
Robby, you're speaking my language here. I'm going to have you back. We'll do a thing on and Armenia. I think that Armenia is very understudied. I think that there was so much interesting things, which you have covered a lot, like Jurvanism, of Yahwehism, of this kind of like, even like the more pure forms of Zoroastrianism. That was all Mandeanism, Manichaeanism. It was all there in Armenia and all there in the Caucasus. So I think that there's something very interesting that was happening there in the first, or maybe we'll say like the 3rd BCE till like the 5th, AD. And also Armenians are Persians in one way of thinking. Right. So, there definitely is. And I think that, it's very complicated, but I definitely think that we are co-creative with reality, and the way that we understand and articulate things also defines reality. And I think that if we do not, I maybe am like outing myself as like a little bit of a Luciferian or a luminist, but I'm really not. But I think that we have that thing as researchers or people who are looking for answers to like the fake play, the fake Maya that they present us with and say, oh, this is the world, but that's not really the world, and that's not even the Maya. That is like the Maya they put in front of us. Right. But really the Mara, and they've called it Maya. So, I think that you're really onto something. I hope that you will come back. I appreciate your time so much. I will just shout out that you sent me the most amazing like care package. Really appreciate it. People can see pictures of it on Insta. For sure. I love your work, Robby. I'm always going to be a big fanboy. But so why don't you plug everything that you have, and then we'll call it.
Yep. So if you want to look at my work, go to my link tree, which is RMARX. And then the final thing I want to say is it's Robert Anton Wilson, who's a chaos magician. But he basically said, after his 30 years of researching the Illuminati, he says that, the real matter of the fact is that you don't know that you're in the Illuminati until one day you are.
Hey, this is Jin the Ninja, and if you enjoyed the show, you can check out more episodes on Spotify and Anchor, and you can check me out on Twitter at Wukong Reborn, WUKONG Reborn, and on Instagram at Threshold Saints. And there's a link tree in the show notes, so you can check out all my appearances and my shows to date.